So why isn't drug repurposing is the default strategy for the pharma, okay? And what's stopping pharma from mining their own archives before spending billions on the new molecules, right?
As opposed to getting 3% of a mega market, you could get 80% of a small market. And the bottom line is, literally, the bottom line is probably fairly similar when you take into account all of the costs for promotion, all of the costs for sales. The insurer who pays the $80,000 for one treatment is not necessarily the same insurer that benefits from that treatment. So they'd rather spend a little bit of money every year rather than take a giant hit all at once. So the result was it didn't get that much use in the US.
Hello everyone, welcome in the another episode of 21 Minute Pharma Edge powered by Game of Pharma. And today's guest took one of the most unusual paths to the pharma boardroom you will ever hear. Elizabeth Aden started her career studying mud and microbes in the remote villages as a biomedical anthropologist, and she ended up as senior vice president at Roche, making billion-dollar drug decisions, okay? And her new book, Mud, Microbes and Medicines, tells that story and asks uncomfortable questions about how drugs get developed, who they are developed for, and whether big pharma's business model can ever truly serve public health. So this is a conversation about drugs that gets made versus the drugs that should get made. Let's dive in. Welcome on the show, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let's go.
Yeah, I think you're in the Spain right now, right?
I am in Spain right now. I'm in Valencia, Spain,
Okay.
which is gorgeous. And we just finished Las Fallas, which is a pagan ceremony ritual that's been going on for about 200 or 300 years, celebrating the end of winter and the beginning of spring, always on March 19th.
Great. Yeah, I think people go for some relief, some take mental life balance, right? Is the Gen Z words that I can bring on the show, right? So let's start the conversation with your journey, right? Like how you have started the things, right? From the biomedical anthropologist, right? Then the pharma, and then I think you started your own ventures as well, and then you worked with some of the M&E's things as well. Lot of things. Just tell us about yourself.
Well, I started in anthropology mostly because I really liked fossil man. I thought it was a really interesting field. And then I realized that it could actually get pretty boring just digging trenches in East Africa.
Yeah.
So in my master's work, I studied Polynesian linguistics and reconstructed Proto-Polynesian. And that really resonated with me because Polynesia is known for beaches and French food. So that was my idea of how I was going to spend 2 years living overseas as an anthropologist studying a culture, Polynesian culture. Didn't quite work out that way, but I did get to beaches and I did get French food. So I ended up in Melanesia, which is a little different from Polynesia, but nonetheless. And I ended up changing from cultural anthropology to biomedical anthropology when I realized I was not going to be, I just really didn't like cultural anthropology. I could see culture, but I didn't want to describe it. So I connected with someone at Penn who had discovered the Hepatitis B virus, Barry Blumberg. And it turned out that where I had spent a summer in Melanesia, in the archipelago of the then New Hebrides, now Vanuatu, that it had one of the highest prevalences of hepatitis B virus or chronic infection with hepatitis B virus in the world. So he thought it'd be great if I could return to Vanuatu. I thought it would be great if I could return to Vanuatu, so I did. And then I studied the natural history of infection with hepatitis B virus for 2 years. I took blood samples. I did ethnographic studies, ethological studies, in other words, quantifying behavior to figure out really how was hepatitis B virus transmitted. And I went back numerous times to see how and who became a chronic carrier of hepatitis B and how one could devise and create a method to prevent that was based on behavior, because at the time there was no vaccine. So from there, after a brief stint in advertising, I ended up in biotech in the area of business development, and that evolved in big pharma into new product planning and strategic marketing. So I was very involved with what became one of the best-selling transplant drugs, CellCept, mycophenolate mofetil, and then devised a portfolio management approach for preclinical projects that led to my going to Basel and ultimately becoming, first the head of global pharmaceutical research strategy, and then ultimately the senior vice president responsible for global pharmaceutical strategy. And then from there, I moved on back to California in stem cell therapy, and then some startup companies, and helped co-found a company in optogenetics. And along the way, I created my own company to resurrect shelved drugs.
Okay.
So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But after that, I then wrote a medical thriller called The Goldilocks Genome, the goal of which is to introduce the lay public to personalized medicine. So that's it in a long nutshell.
Great. I think it's something like a web series only, like you mentioned, right? A medical thriller. So I'm just now waiting that Netflix will reach out to you for the next big pharma series, and you will be the writer for that. So yeah, I think you have some great stories, right? From like the how like pharma has evolved throughout these years, right? So like I just want to ask, like, you have been in boardrooms where $1 billion drug development decisions get made, right? And you started medicines specifically to rescue drugs big pharma shelved, right? And let's talk about the decisions that nobody in the pharma wants to discuss. That is something I called as Game of Pharma. And how does pharma choose which drugs to develop? Is it about saving lives, or is it just about the market size and the ROI?
It's actually not a dichotomy between market size and money. It's actually much more subtle and more sophisticated than that. Saving lives is always important. And if a drug saves lives, that's where pharma goes. Because if it does save lives, then the benefit is obvious, especially if it's the first or second in that class. So gene therapy is a fine example of where drugs save lives, but there are very few people. So it isn't always about the size of the marketplace, because you have to look at how the drug is positioned within that marketplace. The huge marketplaces are usually very, very nebulous. If you look at cardiovascular or neurobiology, they're so big that to find and to get a market share, it's so difficult and so expensive, because these diseases are very, very heterogeneous. The number of ways you can get to atherosclerosis are numerous. So as a result, you have to have huge trials to find the little segment where your drug actually works, and then you get positioned in it, And yes, you may make some money, but it would be more efficient if you knew the segment that your drug worked in, and you could do smaller trials and then own that market. As opposed to getting 3% of a mega market, you could get 80% of a small market. And the bottom line is, literally, the bottom line is probably fairly similar when you take into account all of the costs for promotion, all of the costs for sales. The big markets, the big, huge cardiovascular markets cost a lot, and the promotional costs are huge. So at the end of the day, it really is about saving lives. Is it attractive to look at big markets? Yes. But is that the way it's going to remain? I don't think so.
Good to hear that in the boardroom also there is discussion about the saving lives, right? And it will be there because the people who are behind this industry, right, they are also empathetic into the nature, right? And they also think from that angle only, that whatever the vision that founders have created long years ago, right, they are on the same track, I think. And then that's something that makes this whole industry a impact industry, right, at the end of the day. But like when we were having this introductory call, right, we were just figuring out that what is the single topic that we can discuss, right? It was a list of used topics, right? And then finally, like, what I felt that I have never discussed on a podcast is that commercial drug versus community impact drug, right? Because that's a tension that nobody in the pharma talks, because pharma has both of the sides, right? And you have also seen the both of the sides. So when drug shelved, not because it doesn't work, but because it doesn't make any financial sense, right? How this discussions happens in the boardroom, and how often does it happen in the boardrooms?
So let's talk by community impact. There are two potential definitions of it. One is a community impact in a Western sense, that is something like the fentanyl crisis or the opioid crisis. The other, which I think is what you're referring to, is a community impact more in the developing world. And I think it's an overstatement to say that pharma doesn't take that into consideration. I think the classic example is Merck's decision to make Ivermectin available for free in the developing world for the treatment of onchocerciasis, river blindness. It never charged anything. Now, it happens to also work for treat scabies and a couple of other diseases. It had a brief, resurrection or insurrection, if you will, as a potential RNA antiviral during COVID. And there are preclinical data that suggests that ivermectin is a drug with many different mechanisms of action, including some RNA antiviral activity, some anti-inflammatory activity. The bottom line is Merck made that available. Another story about Merck that isn't well understood or well publicized was Merck discovered the first, or commercialized the first, corticosteroid, which, as we all know, is one of the standards for anti-inflammatory. Corticosteroids are used. Cortisone is used. It's ubiquitous. Merck, although it held the patent on it, made the drug available for free and never exercised its patent rights, period. And that was right after World War II. So pharma has done many things. There are also examples where, at least preclinically, something like cyclosporin A has been shown to be effective, again, in preclinical models, meaning usually animal models, that it's effective against schistosomiasis. Is it used against schistosomiasis? That I don't know, but there are data that suggests that it could be useful. So some of this also, I think, there's data that's available, and nonprofits or global health organizations or even country health organizations have an opportunity to explore the off-label use, if you will, of some of the, 30,000 different chemical entities that are approved throughout the world. And many of them will have efficacy. And to do a clinical trial in a third world or developing country can be very difficult, very expensive, and not necessarily even show efficacy, even if the drug does work, because there's so many confounding variables. And I think it just gets complicated. So I think the better solution is for a local health authority that has a better understanding of the local conditions, the local nutrition, the local circumstances, to work with pharma to get access to the drugs, which usually pharma is happy to provide, and to test them themselves, because there's a lot of nuance when you get into to developing countries. There are co-infections, there's nutrition, there are different. It's an entirely different way of living that the Western world is just totally unfamiliar with.
As you mentioned that there could be two types of community impact drugs, right? And I was also talking about the same that you mentioned, that like community drugs that I think doesn't have much commercially incentive but can affect the developing or the poor countries, right? In that basis, and then my next question just comes from there only, that sometimes like orphan diseases, right, rare conditions, tropical diseases that affect the poor countries or the developing countries, right, these are the classic community impact drug with the not much commercially incentive, right, for the pharma companies. You have been inside the big pharma, okay? Is there any scenario where community impact, okay, wins over commercial viability, or like as a general question, or is just the PR talk?
I don't think it's just PR talk. There have been occasions where a drug, well, first of all, as part of the pharmaceutical research process, drugs or compounds are evaluated for their mechanism of action. We look at what diseases are affected by that particular mechanism of action. So there are times where the mechanism of action for Chagas disease or some of these leishmaniasis, or what you're calling some of these neglected tropical diseases, they have a shared mechanism of action with known pharmaceuticals or developing pharmaceuticals. I think what's going to happen increasingly is, as more information is available on mechanism of action, and right now there's a tremendous amount of that available in the literature and accessible through machine learning or large language models, AI, that in the developing world, there's the opportunity to repurpose a lot of drugs. And I think that's really where the next breakthrough is going to come. That there's enough out there right now that is able to do a lot of good. For example, there were two, 20 or 30-year-old drugs that are effective against Chagas during the acute phase. Is it available? A lot of that's going to be driven by having diagnostics. So can you get an accurate diagnostic quickly, readily, at the point of care, and then dispense the medicine. So I think the medicines and the potential medicines are out there. The real question is, how do we diagnose and how do we get those medicines to the people? And then getting the medicines to the people, I don't think pharma is the block, because they've already gone out of their way to make drugs available for developing countries at virtually no cost or minimal cost. So I think the real question is access and real-time diagnostics and having the medicines available and giving them to people when they need it.
Also, like you are the author of Mud Microbes and the Medicines, right? As the title suggests, right? A journey from the real world impact, right, to the corporate strategy. And so a question, okay, that comes from a 24-year-old person, like, who wants to build his career as well into the pharma, right, and also want to be in the boardrooms. So I just want to ask you, did you lose something when you moved from field research to the boardrooms? And did pharma lose something by not having more people like you who actually been in the mud?
It's a really interesting question.
Right.
First of all, I think I gained a lot by going to pharma because I'm a learning curve junkie. I love learning, and I love going up the learning curve. So, but what did I gain from doing field work in Vanuatu and from being trained as an anthropologist? So a couple of things I learned. One was that you never accept anything at face value. You keep asking the same question over and over again, because as an anthropologist, as you know, you're ignorant in this other culture. You don't know anything about that culture. So you keep asking the same question. And what's interesting is you get different answers. And you get different answers from people based on their gender, based on their position, and based on your understanding of the language. So questions I asked when I only spoke English or Pidgin English, the answers were different from when I spoke their language. So what it means is that you don't always accept the dogma that you're told. You come to your own synthesis, your own, if you will, your own experience of what is real. And I think that was very important for me. And what I learned in pharma was that where I made the contribution was by questioning, by asking people in chemistry, asking the same question of biologists, the same question of clinicians, of people in manufacturing, and people who were physicians in the field, if you will, treating patients. The more questions I asked, the more nuanced my understanding became and the more effective I became. So it wasn't a question of just saying one size fits all. It's a question of understanding where is the nuance and recognizing that one size does not fit all, that there are differences, that the established dogma isn't always right, and that you have to keep questioning and finding new and different solutions. I don't know if that answers your question, but the bottom line was pharma was a lot more fun, and the real world was a lot more work.
Right. So when I talk to some other guests as well, they tell the same thing, right? Like, people from outside from the industry, they think that pharma is something like really boring, right? Like, you are just surrounding with the medical fraternity, like you guys every time you guys discuss the scientific communication and all of that stuff. But I always tell them that, like, let you just go to a medical conference and start talking to someone, like, you will get the best experience of your life, right? You just have parties with the doctors after the conferences. Okay, you just have communication. You will just find some pharma geek, okay, like who worked in a pharma marketing side. You will get uh, like you will get a lot understanding, a lot culture information by traveling to the different place that pharma gives in the job rules, right? So I think it's a fun to work in the pharma, that I must say, and that people same guest also told me multiple times. So from there also, okay, one question also came just in my mind, right? That pharmacogenomics, right, and the target therapies and companion diagnostic, right, these should I think make drugs work better for the specific population, okay, but they also make drugs more expensive and market smaller, okay, that's for sure, right? Did so as you mentioned, like we were discussing earlier in our introductory call, that we can discuss precision medicine as well. So this question is related to that only. Did precision medicine solve the commercial versus community problem, or it make it works? Because as you know, that more expensive, but and market is also smaller.
Well, what you're forgetting in this is also efficacy. When you're dealing with a smaller market, you're also generally dealing with a drug that is more effective. So it gets complicated. So, for example, let's talk about the precision medicines in cancer therapy. So that began with discovering the genotype of different tumors, which led to precision medicine in oncology. And in many cases, it made, if you had the right configuration, you could expect cancer, your particular cancer, to become more of a chronic disease rather than a death sentence. So then that gets into the question about medical resource utilization. So if you can, and the value of life, if you will. So the quality of life, the value of life in America. Well, first of all, the value of life differs depending on what country you're in. In America, quality of life is somewhere between $150,000 to as much as $500,000 a year. Let's call it $150,000 a year. So if I'm giving you 5 years of life, that has a value. If I'm giving you no years of life, that also has a value. So pricing becomes complicated because it does tie to not only the quality of life, it ties to how much of medical resource do you actually use? Are you saving visits to the intensive care unit? Are you saving hospital visits? Are you saving medicines? Are you saving physician visits? Are you saving time that somebody has to take care of you? So all of this goes into the calculation for what is the value of that drug, that medicine in that country, which is also why you see differences in pricing between countries and sections of the world. The US has certainly in general, the highest pricing in the world for drugs. It also has the highest healthcare costs, which it becomes kind of a doom loop, if you will. Higher drug costs, higher medical healthcare costs. When you save it, it leads to a higher benefit of the drug that makes the change. Well, how do we get out of this loop? From my perspective, the simplest way is not necessarily a companion diagnostic, because that's expensive. Is the lowest hanging fruit is to include genomics, full DNA, into everyone's medical record. At an absolute minimum, that could reduce healthcare costs in the US as much as 30 or 40%. So you have the person's genetics as part of their medical record. The physician does the diagnosis. You have an AI interface that says, oh, well, this person has depression. Well, what are my now options in terms of prescribing? Do I prescribe something like an SSRI that's metabolized by one of the liver enzymes? Oh, let's see. Let's let an AI interface run the analysis. Oh, this person is a slow metabolizer of an SSRI. So either I lower the dose or I put them on an antidepressant that isn't metabolized by one of the liver enzymes. Now, that alone can start to save a lot of costs and a lot of physician time and a lot of patient distress. So that's my vision of how the world starts to evolve. And then, you can go up the chain, up from the gene to the protein to the metabolome, but that's way in the future. So I'd argue that before a companion diagnostic, I'd include the genome in part of everyone's patient record.
Many companies, many startup companies, I must say, that are working on this thing, and then it's creating a whole new impact, right, in the whole healthcare industry. And I think big pharma is learning from those companies, like where on the smaller scale only they are creating an impact, and with, I think, big pharma's push, those companies. Because healthcare, when I started this podcast, okay, in each and every after each and every episode, what I figure out is healthcare is all about the partnership game, because everyone is trying to create the impact, right? Everyone is figuring out that community impact. So suppose if big pharma has the resources and startup has that tech, or as you mentioned, that genomics data, how they can articulate genomics data more elaborate or like in an impactful manner, right? I think both can partner and both can create that thing for that. And from there only, like last time, that we were just discussing that thing called I think data archive, right? That pharma has a lot of data. So we were discussing that developing a new drug sometimes costs billions, right? And takes 10 to 15 years, right? And repurposing an existing drug with safety data could take a fraction of that time and money, right? So why isn't drug repurposing the default strategy for the pharma, okay? And what's stopping pharma from mining their own archives before spending billions on the new molecules, right? And I think more as AI is coming up into the picture, right? It's becoming a fraction of the time to just repurpose that data, right? Previously it was a longer journey, but now it's really easy, right?
Well, it's an interesting approach because we talked about that a lot when Syntex was acquired by Roche. And part of the question is, yes, there's this huge repertoire of shelved drugs or shelved molecules, but we don't really know a lot about them. We know their structure for the most part. And as AI or large language models become increasingly sophisticated, we can do more in terms of a computational analysis. But computational analyses aren't always quite as good as one would think. And I do think that you will see more reaching back into some of the libraries that exist. And they do all the time. We just don't know about it because most of the molecules that are in the libraries have never been patented. And whether or not you can develop it does in fact depend on what the patent whether it falls under someone's patent or whether it's patentable, but there are usually ways to get around that, either through delivery mechanisms or manufacturing mechanisms, or there's usually some way. So that's one approach, using the archive, if you will. The other question in terms of repurposing, there are two elements to that. One is the classic example of, there are two classic examples. One is methotrexate, which was used initially in oncology. And then because, again, it had many different mechanisms of action, was repurposed, and through dosing and it's mostly dosing and the regimen, into a very effective drug to treat rheumatoid arthritis. So that certainly happened, and it certainly is current. As is thalidomide. Here was a drug to treat morning sickness that ended up being teratogenic, and now is a very effective treatment for some forms of lymphoma. So when you repurpose a drug like that, even though there may not be patent exclusivity, there are considerations for market exclusivity. In the US, a new drug, or the first to hold an NDA for a specific molecule, even if it's off patent or unpatentable, offers 5 years of market exclusivity. If it's for an orphan drug use, it can get 7 years. In Europe, you get 10 years of exclusivity, as long as, you get 10 years of data protection, which means that it's effectively market exclusivity. For someone to come into that market, they would have to do the same set of clinical trials. So there are some mechanisms that allow you to give you some exclusivity. You can also extend a drug in a new indication for an additional 3 years if you're the primary developer. That's often not done. It's a place where it's really very rare that you see a drug that's gone generic have new indications. And in that case, there's very little that stops a physician or a clinician from prescribing that drug for an off-label use. The question would be then whether or not it's reimbursed. But if it's generic, it could very well be affordable. So there are mechanisms around that in terms of how people get treatment.
Right. And as you mentioned, that some of the drugs that previously scientists were discovering the use case, the impact was different, and then later it comes out in a different thing, right? I think if I'm not sure, but I think GLP also just some way, right? It's just come for the diabetes segment, and then now it's booming into the obesity market. So some way, I think impact are different. And I think GLP-1, when I just had discussions with one of the KOL of obesity market in US, okay, and then he mentioned that some way it impact in the Alzheimer's, and like we discussed a lot of points in that podcast. So I think it's totally relates with your point, right? But again, right, like come to your journey, okay? You led strategic pricing at the Roche, right? Here's the questions that everyone wants to answer, right? Not only pharma people but also non-pharma people, right? How does pharma actually decide what to charge for a drug, right? Because it's not something that everyone knows, right? And then because from the outside, right, it look arbitrary, right? And a drug cost $100 in India. Sometime it's cost $10,000 in the US. Same molecule, same thing, but what is that formula?
Okay, let's take two examples. One I know very well, which is CellCept. When we did the clinical trials for CellCept, and we did them in 3 different geographic areas, the US, Australia, and Europe. As part of that, we did a complete medical resource utilization. So we tracked everything that would happen to those patients in terms of, did they visit the doctor? Did they have lab tests? And the endpoint was the reduction in acute rejection. So acute rejection can leads to hospitalization. It leads to more diagnosis. It leads to biopsies. It leads to expensive treatments, etc. So we kept track of all of that. And so what we did was we said, all right, this is the money that we saved in the US. This is what we saved in Europe. This is what we saved in Australia. And we said, this is the maximum we could charge for the drug, but we're not going to do that. So we charge substantially less than we actually saved. So then that becomes the cost of the drug as it goes out. So pharma has its price. And then because it gets a little bit more complicated, especially in the US, it's picked up by middle people. So there are companies like pharmacy benefit managers that are the intermediaries between the insurers and the pharmaceutical company. And that gets very, very complicated there. And then there is the average wholesale price and the average price to an insurer and their rebates. It gets very, very complicated. But the bottom line is, at least from the pharma side, it's tied to reality in terms of the actual savings that the healthcare system should realize. And as we discussed earlier, the costs of healthcare are different in the United States versus Europe versus Australia and other places throughout the world. Another example that's very much one that highlights the difference between, for example, India and the US, is Sovaldi, which is the Gilead's cure for hepatitis C, which is in the US, the lifetime cost of treating a person with hepatitis C virus is about $250,000. The cost of a 6-week course of Sovaldi is about $80,000. And, these are rough estimates. In India, it can be, when it first came out, it was about $800. I think it's now less. And so the question is, why? Well, in the US, it's technically saving the healthcare system money. But it got really very convoluted because in the US, the health insurance is fragmented. So the insurer who pays the $80,000 for one treatment is not necessarily the same insurer that benefits from that treatment. So they'd rather spend a little bit of money every year rather than take a giant hit all at once. So the result was it didn't get that much use in the US, and in the population where it was used, it wasn't terribly effective. At a lower price in India, that actually got complicated because of the patent situation and how India handles IP. As it turns out, I believe that there are generic manufacturers of Sovaldi, and Gilead gets a certain percent of sales from all of the Sovaldi sales. But the net is that hepatitis C is less of a problem, substantially less of a problem, in the areas where the price is much lower and more accessible. So it's a complicated calculus, and the US is really in many respects an outlier, both in how it approaches healthcare, the fragmentation of the healthcare system, and the lack of insurers benefiting from doing treatments that in a funny way are curative. So from my perspective, in some cases, what we see is a perturbation of our insurance system unless the pharmaceuticals themselves.
Same, I think the cost of like bringing the molecule to that market is also different. So sometimes it's solely depends on there as well, like clinical trial cost and then regulatory cost. I think that also somewhere a dependable asset to bring a drug to a market, right? And for now I just want to talk to a exciting topic, okay, that I think we discussed in the parts, but yeah, I just want to discuss it full fledged, that you developed the launch plan and the branding for CellCept, okay, as syntax, okay. That drug became a, I would say, blockbuster in the transplantation, okay. And I think that was one of the like case study that every pharma brand manager or marketing manager, I think they read in their test books or they listen that case study, right? So walk me through that, how you position a drug in the marketplace, because it's not just about the efficiency, right? It's about the narrative, it's about the timing, it's about who you target first, right? And what did you do with CellCept that made it win in that market?
Oh, CellCept. The love of my life, CellCept, or MICO, as I used to call it, or RS as the transplant physicians called it. The first thing was talking to people, talking to transplant surgeons and talking to transplant physicians, understanding what they wanted, what patients needed, and what the drug itself could do. It was really important to know what was possible, how the drug worked, what it could do. For example, it had some benefits potentially in mitigating chronic rejection. Well, how could that be useful in a heart transplant? How might that be useful in a lung transplant? What about kidney? What about liver? Each of these organs are different in terms of how they function, the drugs that they interact with, because it's a multiple drug therapy. So what I found was I didn't really need to be super smart. I just needed to listen and understand which physicians were very good at marketing, which ones were very good at the science, which ones were very good at understanding how patients thought and felt. And then my job was really to put that together and put it into a marketing plan that made sense, and know who to invite to different conferences, because I knew what their hot buttons were or what their interests were. The other thing that turned out to be incredibly important with CellCept was that we positioned the trials, the clinicians that were part of the phase 3 trials actually did about 60% of kidney transplants in the US. And one of the things that's very important for a physician is to have experience with a drug before they adopt it, before they become comfortable with it. So the physicians that were part of the CellCept clinical trials had fully a year or two to become familiar with the drug and know how to use it. That probably was the single biggest thing that we did to accelerate product adoption. And once it was used in kidney, the people we had on our scientific advisory board were thought leaders in both cardiac and liver transplantation. And as a result, they were very quick to adopt it and very quick to incorporate it into their regimens. It became then very easy to have people want to use CellCept in cardiovascular transplants and lung transplant as well as liver. So that was critical. Who we had on our advisory boards and where we placed the drug in terms of its clinical trials was critical to the product's adaptation and use, adoption.
No, I think it's something that is a case for every pharma brand manager, the marketing manager should listen this point that you should categorize your target market, right? That someone who is great at speak, let's invite him as a conference as a spokesperson about the drug, right? And if someone is really like marketing kind of a guy, right, as you mentioned, right? So we need to create that whole agenda according to the persona that your customer or your HCP has, right? And on the basis of that you should create the strategy. I think that's quite a great learning for every pharma brand or the marketing manager, right?
One thing I would say is that I think a mistake that people make is they go and get who they think is the biggest thought leader in the whole area. And we started doing that by talking, but we decided we would go interview everyone before we asked them to join our advisory board. And we asked people, who do you like? Who do you like? So we did that. And then we interviewed them personally. We visited them. And then we decided that there were so many smart physicians out there and so many smart surgeons out there. We actually wanted people that we could not only talk with, but we wanted to have dinner with. And that really narrowed the list down because, shockingly, there are a ton of egomaniacs out there that you really don't want to sit through dinner with. So we went for people who were a combination of really smart, insightful, but also personable and nice.
I agree. I think it's really important. So, on a side project, okay, I do podcasts with the doctors as well, right? In India, okay, and then like some doctors are damn really nice, okay. Like I just must say this thing. So I start with their college journeys and their like how they started their medical education, and then now how they keep them every day energetic, and they feel really special when someone asks those type of questions, right? And someone, as you mentioned, right, they are just come with that face, and then that but yeah, I think at the end of the day, like is it's just about the nature of the people, right? That how they come on board and how they and at the end of the podcast you feel also the same, right? But people consider that this podcast is something that's very serious, and but this gonna be happen. And I must say that doctor who are very funny and the jolly in the nature, right? People really love their podcast. People really love to listen them, right? And then yeah, it makes sense. And the same point that you mentioned. So in the last, okay, the one of the questions that I want to ask you, like you wrote this thriller, okay, both about the medicine, science, strategy, pharma, all those, okay. If a young pharma professional, okay, reads both the books, right, what's the one lesson that about drug development, okay, about the pricing, about the positioning that connects both books, okay, and was the thread running through your fiction, okay, or your real story that pharma needs to understand, or pharma is not the TG?
So the one theme that runs through everything is that one size and one approach does not fit all. And that's true for global health. It's true for pharmaceutical drug development. It's true for everything, that there is nuance in the world. It's that one size doesn't fit all, that there is benefit to understanding the nuance in the same way that global health strategies don't work for everyone. It's easy for us to say, well, we're going to make one medicine and this is who it treats. But the reality is people are different, geographies are different, customs are different. People are different, and we need to take into account those differences. And we're at a point now where we have so much technology, so much information, and we have the ability to actually take advantage of those nuances and give people, whether they're in Central Africa or Central USA or Central Europe, the medicine, the dose, and the treatment that is right for them.
So just to quickly wrap it up, okay, I will ask you some of the rapid fire questions, okay, and you need to just answer it in a word or a phrase, okay. So it will be an exciting questions, okay. So what's your favorite, island field research or big pharma boardrooms?
Oh, probably big pharma, just because there's so much more diversity.
Cool. One drug you wish you could unshelve right now.
Sorry, one more time?
One drug you wish that you could unshelve right now.
Oh, lizabamide for the treatment of Alzheimer's. It's still the best drug out there, but that's not out there.
Right. Best business decision you have ever made in your life.
Oh, fighting to keep CellCept alive, because the first, after all the patients were enrolled, an analysis was done of the incidence of acute rejection, and the company wanted to kill the drug, and we fought to keep it alive and repowered the clinical trials so that the drug actually became a drug.
Great. Yeah. I think CellCept is the title thumbnail of this podcast, right? Uh,
Only you would have it SELL.
right. I think next question is related to you. What's your secret talent that nobody in the pharma knows about? Like no one in your industry.
I think it's really curiosity and being willing to question dogma and be the master of going between being interdisciplinary and asking questions and not accepting dogma.
So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being on the show. Okay, it was a fun conversation, and then as in our introductory call as well, I mentioned that you are one of the the topic that we discussed, right? It's one of the important topic that everyone wants to listen the pharma, because sometimes people are also not clear about that it will be more commercial impact drug versus community impact drug, right? And something like the podcast is something that it's coming from the big pharma's boardroom, right? And thank you so much for being on this show. It's really my privilege to host you on Game of Pharma.
Thank you very much. And one thing I'd like to just make available is that on my website, elizabethreedaden.com, there is the how to download drugs and genes, at least my one person's guide to pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. So it's a guidebook on how to decipher whether you and your drugs have a Goldilocks effect and where on the Goldilocks effect you are. So I would encourage your listeners and viewers to explore that at elizabethreedaden.com.
Great. People just read this book, okay? Because I have done that to a certain extent. I'm still reading that, okay? And then it's something that's quite I think innate MBA for me in the pharmaceutical. The reason being that I'm reading it at my pace. So yeah, thank you so much again, Elizabeth, for being on the show. Thank you.
And thank you, Lokesh.